Welcome to the Journal podcast from the Chartered Insurance Institute, a place of thought-provoking discussion from the world of insurance. I'm Tim Hurst, Social Media and Production Manager at the Chartered Insurance Institute. In this episode, we're focusing on challenges in supporting vulnerable customers within the claims process. We'll be discussing what vulnerability is, potential signs of vulnerability to look out for, and the steps individuals and firms can take to better support vulnerable customers. We will also be speaking about the recent CII report on managing customer vulnerability with insurance and personal finance. Joining the discussion with me is Claire Lashbrook, Director of Supply Chain at Claims Consortium Group and member of the CII's Claims Community Board, and Sarah Durkin, Head of Counter Fraud at Woodgate and Clark. Thank you both for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
It's great to have you both here and really looking forward to a good, insightful session. So could we just get a little bit about your role and from your experience, why supporting customers in vulnerable circumstances is important in claims? Sarah, could we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Well, I'm the head of counter fraud at Woodgate and Clark. So obviously I'm dealing with customers from a claims perspective, but obviously with a slight fraud head on as well. So my role really would be, the importance of it is identifying the correct claims where there are some genuine fraud concerns, to divert it away from the normal claims process into my team, where one of the team would have a look at it, conduct some investigations and ascertain whether their concerns are genuine or whether it's just something else that triggers something, particularly being a vulnerable customer or someone who's neurodivergent. So it's really kind of protecting the honest customers and making sure that if there is something that needs looking at, that we look at it. And as soon as that concern has been alleviated, that it is returned to the normal claims process and that claim is allowed to continue its journey.
Sounds really interesting. And Claire, what about yourself?
So I'm Claire Lashbrook and I'm the Director of Supply Chain at Claims Consortium Group. So my role inside the business is to oversee our network of surveyors, builders and content suppliers. And I think in terms of customers in the vulnerable circumstances, I think, well, all customers deserve to be supported during the claims process, because for many, it's going to be the first and hopefully the only time they're going to need to use that insurance policy. And we know that customers only really experience the true value of that insurance policy that they've purchased when they make the claim. Vulnerable customers will often need that extra level of care, and it's important that we identify how we can give them the personalised support that they need to ensure that the claims journey doesn't really cause them any additional harm or distress. Absolutely.
I think quite a lot of the time when people are claiming from their insurance, they're possibly going through a sort of vulnerable situation anyway. I think especially when you look at some of the sort of more severe side of things of like fire and flood, it's definitely important to be considered in this process. The FCA defines vulnerability as circumstances that make someone more susceptible to harm if firms don't act with care. So how does that resonate with your experience in claims? Claire, if we just come back to you first on that one.
Well, funny enough, you just mentioned it, Tim. I think by its very nature, having to make a claim, it's a really stressful event, isn't it? It's something as a customer, you don't want to be experiencing that at all. And we've seen even the most resilient individuals, they can experience vulnerability during the claim process at any point. So it's really important as claims professionals that we remain vigilant to ensure that we're able to identify customer vulnerability and act accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sarah, what about your experience?
Yeah, certainly we've had a rise within the team recently, particularly over the last 12, 18 months, of vulnerable and neurodivergent customers. And what's become apparent to me really is how we communicate with the different types of audience that we've got, and to make sure that they are not disadvantaged by either a mental, neurological condition or a financial or situational factors that may have made them a vulnerable person for that particular moment in time. So really, for me, it's about adapting our communication style and asking the person concerned how best we can communicate with them to ensure that their claims journey, albeit as we've already highlighted, can be very stressful, how we can make it less stressful and more manageable for them, and how we can assist them to give the information that we need in order to validate their claim.
No, that sounds very important, and definitely it's something that people should be more aware of. Sticking with sort of the FCA and the consumer duty raises a bar for fair outcomes. From your perspective, Sarah, why is understanding vulnerability critical for meeting these expectations from the regulator?
Well, obviously, we've all got a regulatory obligation to identify and detect fraud. I mean, certainly as part of my role, I'm providing management information to our clients as to the types of claims that we're dealing with, the types of policyholders we're dealing with, and whether there is any fraud there is across their book of business. And that's all very well. We can get bogged down in statistics, but we have to remember that there are people sitting behind all of this. So I think failing to adapt our way of dealing with vulnerable customers puts them at risk. It can lead to poor outcomes and obviously reputational damage for the insurer and ourselves as appointed by the insurers to deal with the claim. And then it ends up where nobody wins, So it's very important really to make sure that we identify any vulnerabilities and reasonable adaptations required at the outset of a claim, and making sure that that information is then communicated to all the parties that will have an input into the claim process at some point, so that the individual party isn't actually having to constantly repeat themselves or disclose a particular vulnerability to each different person that they might deal with. So it's really from an organizational perspective, making sure we do right by that particular customer, making sure the journey is stress-free as possible and in a way that they feel more comfortable to get the best from them so that we can get more positive outcomes. And obviously then, won't have a reputational damage as well to the organization.
Very important factors outlined there. And Claire, what about your perspective on this?
I think without an understanding of vulnerability at every level inside your organization, you can't reasonably be expected to identify the vulnerable customers in the first place. So training at every level is essential. And once all the staff members have been empowered to adequately identify vulnerability, you can record this with your customers' consent, of course. You'll have a consistent flow of data inside the organization, which can help inform your vulnerable customer strategy. And you've identified the touch points in your process which can cause harm. And then you can develop that strategy to help mitigate it.
Yeah, definitely some important steps you highlight there. As we record this week, the CI group have launched new guidance to support insurers and financial planners with assisting vulnerable customers. And this new guidance highlights indicators for health issues, life events, or low resilience. What signs do you see most often in claims? Claire, do you want to take that one?
I think our claims handlers are more aware of the range of vulnerabilities to look out for since Consumer Duty, and the new CI guidance reinforces these. We're kind of seeing a real mix across the board. I'd say there's definitely been an increase in customers struggling with financial problems. Certainly over the past couple of years, there's been a real increase in those. And our teams are regularly signposting customers towards various mental health charities, a big increase in that, certainly in the past years. It's always hard for our team members when communicating with customers that are having suicidal thoughts. Whilst these matters are often not claim related, it can be life events that are happening kind of outside of the claim, and the claims may be highlighted issues that are happening in their own life. It definitely highlights the need for firms to focus on employee well-being as well as customer well-being. So there's a lot going on. It's health, mental health and financial, I'd say, a lot at the moment.
You highlighted there the impact that claims can have on those working in the profession, and that's something one of our New Gen groups did cover off a few years ago. So that was a really great report and really some great insights into that. And obviously we'll direct listeners to look at that report as well. So sticking with the guidance though, for the time being, Sarah, what were your thoughts on this in terms of the signs you see most often in claims?
Yeah, I mean, by the time a claim has been generally referred to us, there are some concerns with the claim or the way that the customer has presented themselves. And the key thing for me is traditionally we have a set of fraud indicators that we have a look at in terms of behaviours and characteristics associated with fraudulent behaviour. But actually what we're noticing is that quite often someone with a vulnerability, and particularly with some form of neurodiverse condition, may well display the same traits. And it's trying to identify whether that is part of their vulnerability, neurodivergent, mental health, trauma, etc., or whether it is actually them being generally fraudulent and trying to hide the truth of the matter. So for me, this is quite a hot topic at the moment and something that we're finding quite difficult to navigate. And we're looking at clients who have self-disclosed that they've got certain mental health or personal circumstances which might make them more vulnerable at that moment in time. But equally, we also have claims where somebody might not actually be aware themselves, or they might not feel comfortable enough to disclose a certain condition. And therefore, it might become more apparent during the claims process. And while I don't profess to be an expert in anything, I did have a claim recently with a lady who was in her mid-70s who believed that somebody was breaking into her property and causing damage. And when I got there, it was very clear to me that what she was telling me, she genuinely believed to be true. But actually, I thought she had some form of dementia. And therefore, her behavior wasn't about deliberately submitted a fraudulent insurance claim. She genuinely believed that people were coming into a house and causing this damage. And I could find no evidence of it. And some of the damage wasn't damage at all. It was wear and tear, or it was just things that she perceived to be one thing and I perceived to be something else. And that was really hard because you're then faced with a situation where, as I say, I'm not an expert in dementia, but she was going stages of aggression and anger at certain points. So I was having to adapt my behavior around her. And then for me, it's then what do we do with that information when we leave? How do we then record that? Are we allowed to record it? This kind of thing. So for me, this is where it's trying to unpick the different traits and how they manifest and what's actually sitting behind it. And obviously, that's just part of the validation and investigation process from the job that I do.
No, definitely. And I mean, you've both just sort of touched upon this, the challenges with data gaps and communication barriers, which is also highlighted in this new guidance from the CII. Which of these would you say you encounter most and how do you address them? So Sarah, if we stay with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said just there, I would say it's easier, and I don't think it is, but easier in inverted commas if someone has self-disclosed, because then I think you can talk about it. It's in the open. I dealt with a gentleman recently. It was a theft claim. His emails, he started, please bear with me while I navigate my ADHD, anxiety, etc. He started every email in that regard. And as we built up a relationship over the length of the claim, it became very clear that if I sent him an email with a huge prose of text and policy jargon and contained within it, that he was just completely overfaced by it and couldn't cope with it. So when he was then responding to me and only responding to 1 or 2 points within my email, it wasn't because he was being evasive. It was because he was just completely overwhelmed by what he was seeing. So we then agreed a strategy that I would just put bullet point things, short, sweet, to the point. And even if it was a series of emails, he could deal with something in bite-sized pieces rather than, I say, having a whole load of stuff being asked of him at the outset. So because he had disclosed it, it was easier to talk about it. And then I was able to say to him, okay, so how would you prefer to be communicated with? What's the best form of media that we can use? And we worked together on that. In that previous example where I went out to a claim and we were completely unaware that there was any potential mental health or any issue there, suddenly you're having to think on your feet and deal with it. And it's about making sure that we're alive to it, that we're aware of it, and then obviously appropriate training and how you might actually then deal with that once you're actually in that scenario. And then, as I said before, then what do you do with that information? Because are we entitled to record that information? Should we record it? And as I said before, I'm not a medical expert. This is my opinion on something based on what the behaviors are that I'm seeing. So I think, to be quite honest, it's a minefield and it's very difficult to navigate and at the risk of upsetting somebody, but equally making sure that they're not disadvantaged. So it's a real challenge, I think, certainly in the role that I do.
No, definitely. And it sounds like adapting your communications for the needs of your customers is an important step in all of this. Claire, how about you? Have you seen any of these barriers and, how have you been addressing them?
Yes, so reflecting on Sarah's point, some of the language we use in property claims can be confusing to customers. So where possible, we do really try and use plain English without jargon in our emails and letters and prioritizing where we can face-to-face interactions for important conversations. If you've got to make that decision to decline a claim, that decision is explained to a customer by the surveyor at the customer's home so they can ask any questions that they've got there. I think as well, in terms of policy wording, we also regularly feed back to the insurers that we work with areas of policy wording where the customers need assistance with that, areas such as matching of items and whether internal damage caused by rainwater, is it covered under accidental damage when there's no damage to the roof outside under storm? We're regularly feeding back to insurers that customers, especially where there's a lower level of literacy, they're not understanding this. They don't understand when they bought that policy that that's not covered. So it's really important on the supply chain end that we're feeding that back so it's making its way back to the underwriters and the people that are writing these policies, that vulnerable customers aren't understanding the policies that they're purchasing. So we have got that duty there to make sure that's being passed back up the chain, that there is a confusion from customers in the policies that they're purchasing still. So hopefully that's making its way back up and so that customers in future can get a better level of policy understanding from what they're buying there.
Yeah, that cross-functional collaboration is actually something that's stressed in this CII guidance, like you say, from underwriters and brokers in terms of how they're designing the products to obviously yourselves in claims.
Very much so.
And how do you see claims customer service and fraud teams working together to support vulnerable customers?
I think it's really important to strike a balance between supporting vulnerable customers and fraud detection. where customers are attempting to make fraudulent claims, making tactical complaints and attempting to leverage vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities and tactical complaints, vulnerabilities that might not even exist. It's just one of the many methods that are used to attempt to pressurize that claims team into making settlements. I really do not envy our specialist fraud team internally. They're doing a fantastic job of deciphering, trying to work out whether these are legitimate claims or not, treating the customer in good faith, not being pressurized to rush into settling that claim due to a particular vulnerability, whilst also treating that vulnerability as genuine. That's got to be the way forward. I mean, it is possible to continue to conduct the special investigation work whilst putting an adaptation into place for the needs of a vulnerable customer. It is possible. You've just got to keep communicating with that customer every step of the way to make sure that they understand the process that they're going through. It's really essential to keep communicating with them. It's just about balance.
I think that is the key word there, isn't it? Balance, and making sure that you treat everyone fairly in terms of whether they actually do have a vulnerability or whether they're trying to play some sort of card to pull the wool over your eyes. Sarah, what's your experience, and how do you see all of these teams working together?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it is a challenge. And I think some of the stuff that Claire talked about earlier about feeding back is important, to the underwriters, to the policy wording. I think it's important if people are willing to disclose and we can capture that information at the outset of a claim, that information is stored so that everybody has touch points on that claim. It's visible to them, so they're not constantly having to go over it again, particularly if it's some kind of life event that's made them vulnerable and it's traumatic in itself. And the other key thing for me as well is around adapting the communication. So a lot of insurers at the moment have standard templates for avoidance or declension letters or just communication letters that they send out to policyholders. And I've been really advocating just trying to look at those and review those and work out what is the best way to communicate this to this particular customer. And as Claire said there, sometimes it's a case of face-to-face. I've done it before where we've drafted a letter, we've sent a letter, and then we've said, have a read of it. And then we'll have a phone call and we'll go through whatever it is that you can't understand. We go through it in a little bit more detail. And I say the hardest thing is actually where you are declining a claim because people just don't understand what they have done wrong. And a lot of vulnerability, they automatically think it is something they might have done wrong. And it might not be. It might just be a straightforward non-adherence to a policy condition, which has just knocked it out. Trying to explain that to somebody is really hard. And it is a challenge because I was dealing with a neurodivergent gentleman the other week and he said to me, Sarah, I can't lie. By the pure nature of my condition, I can't lie. Now, I'm not sure 100% believe that he couldn't lie, but in his mind, he was absolutely telling me the truth. And I did genuinely believe him. I've been around people and interviews for many years now, and I genuinely did believe him. And he just said, I can't lie. You asked me whether I'd locked the door. And I said, I hadn't. And of course, the policy condition was that the door had to be locked, and trying to explain that. And he said, and now you're telling me that this has caused my claim not to be paid. And he just couldn't get his head around it. So what I have noticed is that it is important to feedback. We need to work together. We need to adapt our communication styles. We need to move forward in terms of how we do that and not one size fits all. I think that's really important. But what I have also noticed is that it is time consuming. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. And we should be doing it. That is absolutely the right thing to do. But it does hoover up a lot more of your actual time and your day job to make sure that you are supporting that customer. And ultimately, if we've got 50, 60% of people now with some form of mental health and increasing on the neurodivergent side, we need to get better at this because otherwise it's going to become to a point where we're not going to be able to manage it because we can't give 50% of the customers 100%, 110% of our time. It's just not going to work. So it's about working smarter, more effectively, making sure that, our customers are not disadvantaged in any way.
Absolutely. And I feel like you've touched upon this quite heavily already, but building trust often means clear communication and empathy, as you explained in some of your examples earlier. So, Sarah, what approaches have you found most effective in claims?
Yeah, well, certainly the recent scenario where I actually had to draft a declension letter and I wasn't quite sure. So what I actually did do is I took all the personal details out of the letter, put it through Copilot, one of the AI systems, and asked them to redraft it for someone who had a particular neurodivergent condition. And it just popped out in a different format, which I thought was amazing. It did it in seconds. And then obviously we can add the personal details in and then get it approved and get it sent off. So I think we have to be careful. I think AI is a very effective and powerful tool. I think it can help us and guide us and rewrite things very quickly, which I've found, which is good. But equally, what we also find is that a lot of insurers are now using things like ClearSpeed, which is a voice recognition type software. and they ask policyholders at the ethanol stage to answer a series of questions. And however they present in those 3 questions, one of which tends to be, is there anything you've told us on this call while you're making this claim that is untrue? If they fail that, then that can be a trigger straight through into a fraud referral. So it might just be that somebody is not happy answering questions and, automatically is just going to hang up and so forth. So I think where AI has a place in the future, I think it can be useful, but equally it also has its limitations. I think it gives us a signpost, it gives us a sense of direction, but you still can't remove the human element from that and the empathy that a human has and the ability to actually deal with that vulnerable customer. And actually, I think a lot of customers who are maybe older are going to find something like AI or something like just completely alien to them, and they just will have no concept about how they're going to deal with that. My mother-in-law doesn't have an email address. She doesn't have internet. She's got no idea. When people say, make an appointment online, she's just like, how do I do that? What is that? I have no idea what that is. So there's a whole range of things out there that we need to be aware of, a whole different range of policyholders with different needs. And it's really about how we're going to actually deal with that as an industry across the board. So there is some consistency, but also that it is appropriate for client needs going forward.
I agree AI can have a huge impact on supporting insurers with their job. And it's something that we are also looking at. Spoiler alert, there is a roundtable on AI and customers, and we are producing a report on that. But like you say, having that human touch, having that human empathy is definitely needed, especially within claims. Claire, what approaches have you found have been most effective?
I think I'll steal Sarah's phrase from earlier. It's not one size fits all. We tend to agree the communication frequency with the customer from the offset, find something that works for them, because every single time we find that each customer is completely unique and the communication strategy has got to be something that works for them. We're finding more and more customers actually don't want to speak on the phone. Shocking, I know. Maybe not the first call, but beyond that, we can have customers that we only ever speak to via text. They don't want to be contacted on the phone at all. They're quite happy to have a text conversation back and forth about various things that are going on in the property, or they just want an email from time to time, or they don't want to speak to us for 3 weeks, then they're happy just to have contact with the builder that's doing the repair. So it's what works for them, really. We like to assign a personal claims handler, because then in the empathy piece, they can just build that relationship with that particular individual. And the thing that works well in terms of the empathy piece as well is that we have empaths, in the claims team. We've got certain individuals that really like dealing with customers that have got health concerns and the life events. And so we have a vulnerable customer team. I know it's a bit cliched and lots of organisations have it, but we've got specific individuals that really get a boost dealing with customers that are going through a hard time. And so these individuals, we nurture them, we support them, we give them additional rest breaks, and they want to be in a team where they really enjoy dealing with customers that are having a bit of a struggle. So we've built that team. They know those customer circumstances inside out, and it works well for them. So those are things that we do.
That's really interesting, and definitely like the change from people wanting to speak on the phone to sort of having that text-based conversation. Probably a bit of a generational thing.
A demographic thing, yeah.
Whereas you're going to have some that will want to speak on the phone because they do want to speak to someone and they don't necessarily want to try and...
Certainly not making any ages comments.
No, absolutely.
It's a demographics thing,
yeah. It's definitely demographical. And, I'll be honest, I think sometimes I prefer speaking to someone on the phone than sort of having to have a back and forth. It's better actually if I just speak to you because I can just get it done. So that tailored approach, definitely important. And just the final question, and it is sticking with the guidance. The CII's guidance suggests proactive identification and inclusive design become standard. In your opinion, Claire, how do you see claims evolving to meet these expectations over, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Kind of what we were talking about earlier in relation to policy wording, I think. Inclusive design is going to have a really positive impact in the claims space, because it can be, both Sarah and I are kind of on that end of it, when it's really challenging explaining to a customer why their claims aren't covered. We're the ones that get to deliver the outcome, don't we? In terms of those sections, we're rooting through with the customer in the policy wording with them so they can understand why that particular thing isn't covered, why there's that particular exclusion there, and going through and working through with them, especially if they're vulnerable. It can take a little bit of extra time explaining to them and interpreting with them why that's not covered with them. So I think if those policies are then going to be marketed for inclusivity in every level of literacy, that should make our lives a lot easier. So we welcome that. I think over on the claim side of things, that's going to be really great. In terms of proactive identification success, I think that's going to depend on customer willingness. I think I've seen a bit of a change in that. I've seen an increase in customers agreeing to share their vulnerabilities. I've seen a bit of a change because a few years back it was a bit of a challenge because maybe there's a bit of shift in society. Naturally, we can't pass on to, third parties in our supply chain because we work with lots of different, drying companies, and you've got a surveyor, you've got a contractor. And previously, maybe a customer would have, when they've had a rapport with a claims handler, would have said, I've had that dementia diagnosis. But there would have been a bit of reluctance. I don't really want the other suppliers to know. And that can create a little bit of a problem because it would have been beneficial for the other suppliers to know. But I have seen a little bit of a change, I think, in the past few years of customers, a bit more willingness. So hopefully, I think proactive identification will be reliant on customers actually wanting to participate, in those surveys. So hopefully customers will agree if those surveys are going out, that will be dependent on customers wanting to share that data. Because if we don't get those responses to those surveys without customers saying, I'm going to participate and I'm going to give my data over to the insurance companies, so yeah, we'll see. I think on that one, jury's out.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a shift in sort of that stigma around vulnerabilities. And I know that Sarah mentioned earlier about certain diagnoses being made more common now. I think it's not necessarily just about withholding. They might have ADHD or be on that sort of autism spectrum.
Yeah.
It's more that it's gone undiagnosed previously because it's been so slight, but now it's coming more to the fore and more people are getting that. And, I think that lack of stigma around it makes them more willing to share it because in the long term, it does benefit them, like I say, in terms of getting that better service, better communication and better the insurers.
I would definitely agree. So I volunteer as a Dementia Friends Ambassador for Alzheimer's Society. And I found that even when I'm in the community or doing those awareness sessions, when I first did the training to become a Dementia Friends Ambassador, there was a lot of people in the community that wouldn't have come forward to say, I have a dementia diagnosis. But even in the past 5 years when I've been doing that, there's a lot more people either in the sessions or in the community that will actually say, I have dementia. The stigma would have been, I don't want to be judged for saying I have dementia. And now I say there's a lot more people that will actually actively say I have dementia because they can see that by saying that, I'm more likely to get that support and it's more accepted to say I have dementia now.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely seeing that shift. So hopefully those initiatives will get that uptake that is needed.
No, definitely. And coming to you, Sarah, what do you see as sort of the evolution of claims over this next 5 to 10 years?
Well, just even the 5 years that Claire's just talked about there, and we've all just talked about the fact that in a good way, we've come, leaps and bounds on in terms of, people openly, willingly wanting to talk about it. I think that's been, with celebrities and the royal family and everybody encouraging people to talk about it, I think is a real positive sign. So where we're going to be in 5 to 10 years, I don't know, because there has already been a marked increase in people who do consider themselves vulnerable, but it is a transient state. We've all been there. But certainly on the neurodiverse spectrum, I was dealing with one of our suppliers actually, and he said that he took his son for an ADHD diagnosis. And while they were assessing him, he's sitting in the background going, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me, and that's me. And at 52, suddenly realized that he also had ADHD. And suddenly he said it just put a lot of things, all the things he'd struggled with in his life, into context. And he sort of understood. He had a bit of a mind-blown moment, but a light bulb moment as to how some of his behaviors had manifested over the years and how he had responded to that. And he said it was, it's taken him quite a while to come to terms with it. So if you then extrapolate that now going forward another 5 or 10 years, is there going to be another 50% increase? And is it going to be the norm that we're all vulnerable or neurodivergent? And actually, with the exception will be people who aren't. I'm being ridiculous, but you just don't know where we're going to be in the 5 to 10 years. And also what society's going to throw at us. We've had a pandemic, we've had all sorts of things. And a lot of people have said that that's stemmed from the pandemic, about feeling more insecure and having a bit more vulnerability and might not have interacted with somebody for a year or two, or didn't leave the house for that period of time. And it has, by whatever has gone on in society, has created the perfect environment where certain vulnerabilities may have manifested over that period of time. But going forward, in terms of the point that Claire raised earlier on about people not wanting to communicate, and you very rarely even talk to a human being these days, it's via text, it terrifies me from a fraud perspective, because obviously we see it from policies taken out online, claims made out online, money paid out online, documents are sent in to validate the claim, and then we pay the claim. And I can only see that process being more automated as we go forward in the next 5 to 10 years. So how do we then identify vulnerable customers out of that and fraudsters out of that? How do we deal with that? Is there going to be some form of AI technology going forward where you speak to somebody that says, yes, what's the nature of your claim? We've already got all these kind of automation services anyway at the moment. And is it going to be the norm to say, do you have any vulnerability or neurodivergent condition that you think we need to be aware of? And if they say yes or no at that point, are you then going to be routed to another system that takes you to the right department or a different way of dealing with you to say, okay, so now you're here now, how would you prefer to talk? Do you want to talk to a human being? Would you rather submit your application online? And they might well be routed through a whole series of automated processes and actually find themselves in a position where they're actually being handled appropriately. I don't know. It could go any one of a number of ways. But I think really it's just making sure that we've all got the appropriate training, that we move with the times, that we are aware of all of this, that we make sure that the communication is designed for accessibility by default, but not exception. The work that Claire's been doing with dementia and more advocates and more people within the insurance industry. We've got a dedicated customer care team that deal with our vulnerable customers. And I can see it now. It is a growth industry within every insurance and adjusting company that I've been dealing with recently. I can see now that there are dedicated teams associated with this. So are they going to grow and continue to grow and be bigger than the claims teams going forward? Because this is where it's all going to be, or should this sort of training be available for everybody? And I think the answer is yes. But it is obviously the practicalities of doing that. So I'd be fascinated to review this in another 5 to 10 years if Claire and I are still here in this situation, when we go back and say, do you remember we had those random conversations and look where we are now? It would be really interesting because I say it's very, very hard to predict, where we're going to be. But I'm hoping it's going to be much more inclusive, much more appropriate, much more customer focused and dealing with people in the way that they would like to be dealt with. But I'm still able to identify if they're a fraudster.
You've both raised some really great points there. It's been really, really insightful talking to you both about vulnerability within the claims process and overall. And I look forward to putting in the date in the diary for 5 years' time to review all of this. So the last thing for me to do is to say thank you both for joining me on the podcast today. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tim.
You're very welcome, Tim. Thank you. Thank you, Claire. Nice to meet you both.
Thank you very much.
See you in 5 years' time.
Yeah, see you in 5 years' time. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Journal Podcast. You can find useful links in the show notes and related to articles on the Journal website, along with further podcasts. Please like, review, and subscribe. Until next time, goodbye.